Hi, thanks, Pete. And thank you all for joining us. And I will introduce and thank my co-participants as we go along. Just to start, I wanted to give a couple of brief introductory remarks on what this panel is and what we are going to be discussing in regarding the Sinicization of Islam in China today, which is, as Pete notes, a timely and important subject. I hope to give a brief overview of the sort of current context and then ask our other panelists to sort of elaborate on the sort of broad implications and historical context of this as well. So we'll have a lot of different aspects of this topic covered. The Sinicization of Islam in China is something that has obviously become a major point in the discussion of China's human rights record, as well as international relations with other countries, as the ongoing crisis in the Uyghur region becomes something that is achieving peak public salience, especially during spotlight events like the Olympic Games. We want to talk today broadly about the sort of political and historical forces that inform what is going on, and then sort of get an understanding of the implications of this. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of context in terms of policy and sort of narrative objectives of the Communist Party's promulgation of this campaign of Sinicization. Most notably, the campaign of Sinicization occurs in large part over the last several years and begins to take shape in many ways in 2014 on a visible level after several violent events and some outbreaks of violence in the Uyghur region. Xi Jinping notably made several declarations that China was going to declare what he called a people's war on terror. And in speeches given in Urumqi to party officials behind closed doors that have since been leaked as a part of the so-called Xinjiang papers, we note that Xi Jinping has addressed problems that he considered to be associated with Islamic radicalization, or in his case, what he called sort of a virus or an infected virus that is radical Islam, one that he associated with distance from Chinese culture. And in remarks were given in Urumqi in 2004, she stated that the cure, quote unquote, cure for this infectious contagion of radical Islam was adhering closer to the Chinese system and the core values of Chinese socialism. The quote you may note is on the screen here, but adhering to Chinese characteristics and realigning religion and Islam with Chinese culture was seen as a core objective from the party in response to these events. These would later take more expression in his address to the 19th Party Congress, in which she specifically said that the basic policy on religious affairs of the party is that the party must uphold the principle that religions in China must be Chinese in orientation and provide active guidance to religions so that they can adopt themselves to socialist society. Now, I want to highlight a couple of things here in these remarks. The association of Islam with extremism in these remarks paints Islam in a threatening light to the Chinese state building project and to Chinese identity, and in emphasizing that this is a contagion that must be cured with Chinese remedies, adhering to Chinese culture. Xi Jinping sets up a Han-centric vision of what inclusion in the state, including via religious practice, may imply. And so this sets up a Sinicizing program that then gains expression in a number of different ways. Now, our other panelists are going to talk about the most prominent examples of this that are happening in the Uyghur region, and I will leave that conversation to them. I want to highlight how this program of Sinicization has spread throughout China and is really a nationwide and comprehensive program of Sinicization by looking at how it affects ethnic Hui communities, ethnic Hui Muslim communities. Hui are often referred to in media as Chinese-speaking Muslims. And we saw as early as 2018 signs that the kinds of Sinicization or alignment of Islam with Sinicized ideals had begun to happen in Hui communities outside of the Uyghur region, including in places like Yinchuan. What you see here is the front gate of the Nangguan Mosque in Yinchuan. This is its pre-Sinicization form in 2016. It is notable that this architecture is strongly Arabesque in a lot of its features, or reminiscent of Mughal architecture, featuring prominent onion domes, crescent moons, and Arabesque features. In 2020, the front gate of the Nangguan Mosque looked like what you see on your screen now. It had largely been stripped of its identifying features as an Islamic building. It's stripped of its Arabic features, and it had been in a very prominent way Sinicized, made to look like more traditional Chinese buildings. This is not the only example of this process. For instance, the Grand Mosque of Huizhou, also in Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region down the road from Yinchuan, was prominently Sinicized with its large domes removed and replaced with roofs that are reminiscent of famous Chinese buildings like the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. This kind of Sinicization, or the adoption of traditional Chinese architectural features, is not only limited to buildings, it also gains expression in Sinicizing other aspects of public space. As this document from the government of the Ningxia Hui Autonomous County, this is often referred to as China's Little Mecca for its historical and cultural ties to the Islamic world. A document on the Sinicization policy pursued in Ningxia highlights how Sinicization also affects other aspects of culture, including the removal of loudspeakers that broadcast the call to prayer, and also of Arabic language and Arabic writing, Arabic art forms in public spaces. The document specifically cites that avoiding the Saudification or Arabization is something that officials in Ningxia need to be put on guard against, to adopt the Sinicization of Islam in China and the alignment of Islam in Ningxia with Chinese characteristics or Chinese culture. It should also be noted that this kind of program of alignment of Chinese Islamic sites with Chinese culture happens in the midst of a rise in Islamophobia that happens throughout China. What you see here are screenshots of a report from The Independent about an instance of Islamophobic attacks on a mosque in Hefei in the province of Anhui, in which a pig's head was buried in the ground at a construction site of a mosque, and imams trying to build this mosque in Hefei received death threats. So the call to Sinicization, or the political moves towards Sinicization, have been echoed in an intensifying climate that associates features of Islam that are foreign or outside of a Chinese cultural context with threat and danger. And this is one of the largest takeaways from this presentation, is that the alignment of policy is such that we want to understand how Islam is being read as both foreign and threatening. Now, I want to pause on one particular example that I think is evocative of how this issue is sort of resonating in popular discourse, and that is the example of the Dongguan Mosque in Xining. Historically, the Dongguan Mosque has been incredibly important for Chinese Islam. It is one of the largest and most prominent mosques in China, and it is also the seat of Ikhwani or Ikhwan Islam, a reformist sect of Islam that is tied very closely to the Chinese Islamic Association and the Chinese state. As it appeared in 2016, the elaborate front gate of the mosque featured very Arabesque features, onion domes, tall minarets, visible crescent moons, and it was a prominent feature of the streetscape in urban Xining. In addition, loudspeakers faced the street in order to broadcast the call to prayer and allow worshipers who spilled out of the mosque courtyard and into a larger space on the street to worship alongside with those who are inside. So you can see here in the picture on the left, the front gate is a front structure in front of the larger prayer hall, and it was a defining feature of this mosque community. By 2020, this space, which as you can see in this photo, had become a congregation point for worshipers in the community and a real focal point of community religious and cultural life, had also been Sinicized. This is how the Dongguan Mosque appeared in 2021, stripped of its domes, stripped of its minarets, and behind construction walls. Why is this transformation from an obviously Arabesque building towards a Sinicized one significant? Well, one, this mosque is a seat of cultural and political significance within Chinese Islam, and it shows that even state and official aligned structures are prone to Sinicization, and it has also become a site that is a significant enough site to promote resentment and backlash from members of the Hui community. Notably, as the building began to be Sinicized, people began to use silent protest in front of the mosque, praying in an obvious fashion, showing remorse that the building was being Sinicized. This one woman's lone prayer went viral on Chinese social media and inspired cartoons that mocked or that mimicked the tragedy that was unfolding. Likewise, it became a flashpoint for international diplomacy. In particular, Christina Scott of the United Kingdom's mission to China has pointed out these Sinicized buildings in her tweets in trying to call out what she views as an abuse of human rights or a cultural erasure. So this is very much a contemporary issue that informs not only relations between China and its Muslim populations, but also how China is dealing with international relations and expressions of relations between countries. So this is why this is a significant and important topic to consider. And this is sort of the background to our conversations today, this ongoing campaign to Sinicize religion and Sinicize Islamic communities is something that is ongoing and long running, and we want to sort of explore the dynamics of this. And I would now sort of like to turn things over to my colleagues in order to fill in the historical and cultural context behind this. So after this sort of table setting, I would like to allow a more expansive conversation from my colleagues. I want to begin by introducing our first panelist, Dr. Hannah Thieker. Hannah is a lecturer of history and politics at the University of Plymouth and visiting fellow at the University of Oxford China Center. Her research explores the history of late imperial China, focusing on social and religious transformation in Chinese Muslim communities following the Great Northwestern Muslim Rebellion of 1862 to 1874. And so I will now turn the floor over to Hannah to provide some historical context. Hannah.
Hi. So first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. You should all now, I think, be able to see my screen. Yeah, I can see some nods, that's fine. So yeah, very much as David said, I really just want to give sort of a little bit of a historical context to this. I work on the historical dimensions of basically some of what is happening today. And I've got a really strong interest in the ways in which sort of history is used and abused in political discourse and online Islamophobia in the Chinese context in the present. I should also state that my remarks today are largely about the Chinese-speaking Muslims, and I'm leaving the history of Xinjiang, Uyghurs, and Turkic speakers to my more qualified colleagues who are following. So it's a stupidly simple point, but I think it is worth stressing actually, is that there have been Muslims in China for a really, really long time. There's been Muslims in China for about 1,000 years, arrived as migrants through trade, through alongside the Yuan dynasty in a lot of places, and many were converts as well. But scholars estimate that Chinese had become the dominant daily use language for what we now call the Hui, the Chinese Muslims, by about the Ming dynasty. Which is to say that there's also a really long tradition of mosque architecture within China. And often in the regions that I work on, the mosques are very much some of the oldest buildings left. They predate everything else around them. And that there is actually what we could describe as perhaps a distinct tradition of Chinese mosque building. But, hang on a moment, there we go. So yes, this is one of my favorite mosques. This is in Shanghai. And I just wanted to show this to give you an idea of what some of this actually looks like. Features I'd point out from this particular mosque, like you have the very distinctive sort of minaret with Chinese style sort of peaked eaves, sort of these distinctive sloping prayer halls. And out front, you have features like the shield wall and all the rest of it. And this mosque is about 18th century. This is not to elide sort of the rest of like the history of Islam in China. The really old mosques in the East are different. And there's variety everywhere, but nevertheless, like these are the kind of mosques that are often described as being syncretic. I'm not sure I like the way that that sets up a binary between Chinese and Muslim, but it's quite useful to note the way in which they resemble sort of other historical religious architecture. They were part and parcel of a very diverse religious landscape. And as some of my other colleagues who focus on history, particularly Tristan and Brown, have emphasized, they fitted into this landscape as well. And official pronouncements at the moment would sort of have us believe that this is evidence of praiseworthy Sinicization, if you like, of evidence of an Islam that did accommodate itself to local conditions. And using that partly almost in the rhetoric as justification for this campaign to take away these foreign elements that are taking, apparently corrupting these communities. I should also stress, though, that perhaps despite the rhetoric, the action at the moment strongly suggests that whatever the rhetoric says, there is no form of Islam Chinese enough to survive. In practice, there is very little space being left. But to return to that idea of a history of Sinicization, the truth is, as ever, perhaps a little bit more complicated. There's never really been a single Chinese Islam. It's always been quite a diverse field, quite varied histories. But I'd like to stress that these questions over what it means to be Chinese and Muslim, or questions of what a Chinese Islam should be like, which lead up to sort of the contemporary Sinicization campaign, are in some senses very, very modern ones. I don't know if it would have occurred always to people to frame them in that way. And so I'd like to take a step back very briefly to sort of some of the older histories of Sinicizing Islam. So across the 18th and 19th century, you see rising discrimination against Muslims, probably occasioned by socioeconomic change and basically an increasing degree of impoverishment. That results in Muslim rebellions in the northwest and southwest, partly as a result of that economic distress, partly as a result of that discrimination. And in the wake of, oh, that's a different mosque, my apologies. More different mosques, a variety of what Islam in China can look like. So to return to rising discrimination. In the wake of those, and this is a decision that I think has consequences that live on, a certain subset of Qing officials promote what can be termed the Confucianization of Chinese Muslims. In the wake of rebellions, you see which occur in the middle of the 19th century, you see strict controls on mosque building. Others are confiscated, turned into shrines and academy, often on the grounds that they'd harbored rebels or set themselves up above the imperial state, and a history of late 19th century campaigns, particularly against Sufi organizations seen as being heterodox. And the image you see there is from a photograph of a gate taken in the 1930s that says, "Do not divide Chinese and Muslim," a slogan from part of those campaigns. The Republican period sees, basically with the rise of nationalism, sort of a generalized set of questions about sort of what being Chinese would mean, and questions then about also correspondingly at the same time, questions of what being Muslim might mean. And it's a period of quite intense change in our global ideas of what it meant to be Muslim and ideas of what it meant to be Chinese as well. So there are connections to global movements sort of across the board. Muslims in China traveling abroad, the rise of new modernist nationalist forms of Islam in China, and tensions there about what Islam is going to look like within Chinese communities. So reprints for correct Arabic pronunciation, against incense burning, mosques to be reorientated, even as other groups argue for basically the reprinting of Sino-Islamic texts. And there's this question, therefore, of like with the new Republican state, which is formally speaking atheist, like where then is religion going to fit in? And so you see here briefly a selection of men who studied in Egypt at the time, sort of key reformers of what Islam was going to be. And leading into sort of the Maoist period, again, through the high Maoist period, we return almost and back to my favorite mosque, where you can still see the Maoist slogans along the wall. Once again, after the communists win, throughout the high Maoist period, mosques are closed, many are demolished, others converted into storehouses, imams imprisoned, and there's a really lasting memory of those times in Chinese Muslim communities. And the importance here too, I would stress, of forms of narratives about Sinicization, particularly in the development of ethnic minority studies and thinking about how ethnic minorities, which Muslims are now defined as, should relate to the state. During reform and opening, mosques are re-established. Basically, religious professionals are released, and there's a certain amount of politicking between different Chinese Islamic groups or relationships with the state. But the key thing I'd like to stress here is that basically it was a point of pride for Muslim communities to re-establish themselves, rebuild their traditions after the closures of the Maoist period. And there's a boom in mosque building, much of which takes patterns from abroad, ideas of what a mosque is going to look like. A re-establishment process. And so I would not, however, state that that necessarily says anything about their orientation to the wider state, but it is part of those communities orientating themselves within wider discourses of what it means to be Chinese and what it means to be Muslim. And I don't think a straight line can be drawn between response to Muslim rebellions in the 19th century, to Maoist campaigns against religion, to campaigns for the Sinicization of Islam in the present. Despite some of the similarities, these are movements that come from quite profoundly different places. But it does add up to a tradition that is being drawn on in state rhetoric. Those histories remain as reservoirs of rhetoric. For example, the policymakers, Islamophobes, and Chinese Muslims are all drawing on in the present. And they frame a lot of the way in which the response in Chinese Muslim communities to this current campaign for Sinicization is taking place. And I'm really looking forward to getting into sort of some of the details of that later in the conversation. So with that, I'd like to hand back to David, please.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This is a very interesting and a sort of historical panorama that we've been providing. Our next presentation will come from Dr. Rachel Harris, who is a professor of ethnomusicology in the School of Arts at SOAS, the University of London. Her research focuses on China's Muslim borderlands, Uyghur religious and expressive culture, and cultural policy and heritage in China. She led the AHRC-funded research project Sounding Islam in China from 2014 to 2018, and co-edited Ethnographies of Islam in China from the University of Hawaii Press in 2021. Her latest monograph, Soundscapes of Uyghur Islam, was published by Indiana University Press in 2020, and I will hand over the floor to Rachel now.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Thank you very much for organising this. It's really great to be engaging in this conversation. So I am coming from really quite a different angle from both of the previous speakers. My work, as David has said, is on expressive culture amongst the Uyghurs. So, of course, over the past nearly 3 years now, I've taken part in a lot of events like this, which have been really trying to raise awareness of what's going on in the Uyghur region. And so I've spent a lot of time talking about really the extremes of the crackdown in that region. So the 1.5 million people incarcerated in internment camps, the widespread destruction of Uyghur mosques, and also holy shrines, pilgrimage sites. In the last year, of course, we've seen something of a shift. So lengthy prison sentences for Uyghur intellectuals and also religious leaders, and the graduates of the internment camps being moved into conditions of forced labor. So all of this, of course, is very well documented. I won't dwell on all of that now. I would recommend to you books by Sean Roberts and also the recent book, perhaps by Darren Byler, Terror Capitalism, which are really excellent analyses and overviews of what's been going on in terms of the politics in that region. Just to throw a small nugget into our discussion today then, I wanted to focus on questions of music and religious practice, in particular a kind of musical instrument called the sapaya. Let me see if I can share my screen. There we go. Is that visible? I'll take that as a yes. Yeah. Yeah. So this loops quite nicely into David's comments about social media and the protests against the removal of the domes in central China. This image that you see here is of a Uyghur, a Sufi, let's call him simplistically. And this short video clip appeared on my Twitter feed nearly a couple of years ago. And this was in response to a big push in the United States to really label what was happening in the Uyghur region as genocide. And as a result of that, we saw a very large number of apparently spontaneous videos created by Uyghurs telling us that everything was fine in the Uyghur region. The Uyghurs were happy and grateful under the leadership of the Communist Party. Let me just play you a bit of this, it is quite fun.
봄파이, аңылдың менің айтқан нақсылымне, бел ұрғойла.
All right, I'm going to cut him brutally short, but it's a great speech he gives. Hey, Pompey, he goes, addressing Mike Pompeo, who was very active in the anti-China rhetoric in the Republican Party in the States. He goes, hey, Pompey, listen to my song, look how free I am. And he claims that he is being supported by the local administration. He is a designated transmitter of sapaya, these percussion instruments that you see him performing there. And he is being supported by the state to teach his art, and everything is great. And look at his beard, you know, he says also, this is a side swipe at the claims as part of the campaign that illegal beards were a reason for being interned in the camps, which I think is actually quite certainly true. So all of these things then are designed to shift the narrative, to sow doubt, and also, of course, to enable a different kind of discourse on international Twitter, right? So I'm particularly interested in this question of intangible cultural heritage in China, and what exactly our man here is transmitting under the leadership of the Communist Party. So we know from some excellent research by some of my younger Uyghur colleagues who are now based in the Americas, of the kind of form that this kind of transmission is taking. So fundamentally, the sapaya as an instrument is performed, is played as part of a Sufi ritual. That is its core function. It's played within the Sama ritual, the 𝗦𝗁𝗲𝗿𝗀𝗙, the 𝗦𝘁𝗿𝗄𝗽 as it's known locally, and it enables the emphasis of the rhythm, which enables those kind of altered states to take place. Now, what is being transmitted today under the heritage system is something that, of course, is very much cleansed of that whole kind of religious context. Songs are performed on stage, which are inoffensive in terms of their religious content, or which are even directly used to praise party policy in Xinjiang. Yeah. So this really is a very typical form of the way that Uyghur heritage is now being transmitted. So some of my more recent search, I am also an exile now. I haven't been getting visas to go back to China now for about 10 years. And so my research has shifted to the Uyghur diaspora. And most recently, I've been working in Istanbul, amongst other places, and talking to Sufi exiles. It's extremely interesting talking to them in terms of history, actually. They have extremely powerful and detailed histories, which really trace very different geographies. It was really great to hear Hannah talking about the geographies of Hui Islam. Also, if we think about the geographies of Uyghur Islam, of course, we can see these very important and deep-rooted networks, which see Sufi lineages, of course, coming out of Uzbekistan, which see Sufis undertaking long journeys through the Hajj and other forms of pilgrimage, and then ending up in Istanbul and other places and establishing their centres of learning or worship there. So I think it is very important to think about these kind of alternative geographies which situate people like the Uyghurs not as minorities within the People's Republic of China, but as people who have geographies which spread, of course, west and south. So this is just a very short comment from a gentleman called 𝗦𝗽𝗲𝗿𝗀𝗿, who we interviewed quite recently, who fled from the homeland, the Uyghur homeland, in 2016. And one of the few things he took with him was his sapaya, very important thing for him, nobody to play with, unfortunately, in Istanbul at the moment. But I was interested, listening back to our interviews. My husband somewhat insensitively said, "Oh, can you play us a bit then? Can you play us a bit?" And he said, you know, if you force me to do it, then it's, you know, my conscience doesn't like it. The sapaya is not something that can just be performed for pleasure. How am I doing for time? Was that 1 minute to go? Yeah, so I will end just very briefly, just to give you a flavour of the sapaya being performed in religious context. This is actually from a 2008 documentary film by a Xinjiang filmmaker. This shows a group of Sufis in a Hanukkah, in a shrine, which of course is now destroyed, and the whereabouts of these people is unknown.
Hay Allah ya Allah ya benden değil Allah. Hay Allah ya Allah ya benden değil Allah. Ya benden değil sen gel.
A brief taste. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, especially for those wonderful video clips that are so illustrative of this phenomenon, and for such an interesting and nuanced and contextualized project. We will turn our final remarks of this panel will come from Dr. Ryan Thum, who is my colleague and a specialist in history and anthropology of Muslims in China at the University of Manchester. He is a senior lecturer here. His book, The Sacred Routes of Uyghur History, argues for the central role of sacred sites and local Islamic texts in the maintenance of Uyghur identity. Thum is an associate editor of the Journal of Asian Studies and a former fellow of the National Humanities Center and the American Council of Learned Societies. So Ryan, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, and thank you for including me in this conversation. I'll be brief. I think maybe what's best for me to do, since I'm actually working on both Uyghur stuff and Hui material, to talk about some ideas that link both of those. And in particular, I want to talk about a way of understanding Muslims in China that I see bridging both foreign scholars like us and the Chinese state's own understanding of Islam in China, which I think is problematic, and that is the notion of syncretism, which has driven, in particular, so much of the scholarship on the Hui, but also has some role in the study of the Uyghurs too. Syncretism is this idea that, in this case, a good concrete way to look at it is the idea that there is a thing called Islam and a thing called China, and when they come together, that you get something new, a mix of two discrete entities. And these discrete entities are imagined in the through the model of syncretism to have their own essential fixed identities that are more or less stable across time. And that is, for the non-academics in the audience, this is the way of looking at the world called essentialism. There are certain traits that make one Chinese in your culture or whatever. There are certain traits that make one a true Muslim or are characteristic of the true Islam. And then there are other characteristics that are sort of a less authentic Islam. And what the idea of syncretism does is takes a whole host of evidence that Islam is in fact Chinese and China is in fact Islamic over the last 1,000 years to one degree or another. It takes all of that evidence, the multitude of mosques across China, the fact that hundreds of millions of Chinese people participate in Hui foodways every day when they eat, the long integration of Muslims into the political history of China. It takes all of this evidence that China is in fact, that Islam is in fact a core part of Chinese history, and it quarantines them in this little safe jar of a syncretized thing, which is neither truly Chinese nor truly Islamic. And we can see a version of this term syncretism in the Chinese language scholarship on Islam in China, and that is Jiaorong, and it is was quite popular before this Sinicization movement. And I suspect that some of the energy in the state's Sinicization push comes from the official state-supported study of Islam in China, with its own focus on Jiaorong, which was developed in part in conversation with Western scholars and the syncretism model, which you can find going all the way back to the arrival of Christian missionaries in the late 19th century in China. So let me, we're getting toward the end of our time, so I want to be super brief, but there are two examples that have already come up today that I think are good ways of pointing out really the ludicrousness of an essentialist and syncretic approach here. One, I think David pointed out something that's often missed in this conversation about Arabization. He pointed out that in fact, many of these mosques that are being damaged because they are too, quote, Arab, have their style is closer to what you would find in India, when he pointed out that these are Mughal. Now, why would the Chinese state look at all of these mosques? And I would say that in general, the mosques with domes in China tend to look more like Indian mosques in India. Why would they look at this clear evidence and ascribe it all to Arabia or Arab influence? That, I would argue, is because of the racialization of Islam that often comes with, that is a part of Islamophobias around the world, and comes with the essentialist idea, where Islam is something that comes from Arabia, thereby is essentially Arab forever. Never mind that for over 1,000 years, most Muslims have not lived in Arabia. And so you get this racialization where the real Muslims, and therefore the more dangerous Muslims, are the ones that are racially similar to people in the Arab world. And this is one of the things that explains why Sinicization has had such a different effect on Uyghurs, who are seen as racially more like Arabs than it has on the Hui. So you have Uyghur children being taken away and raised essentially as Han Chinese. You don't have that kind of thing among the Hui. The other thing I wanted to touch on, which was already mentioned, Hannah Thieker mentioned that the very important point that Islam has been around in China for a long time. I think we can get some value from looking at it from the other end, which is that China has been in Islam for a very long time. If we want to imagine an Islam that doesn't include China, we're basically looking at the first 100 years of the history of Islam. You know, there are Muslims arriving in China probably within the first century of Islamic history. So there's really not much left to Islam if we cut out all of the periods in which there were interactions between Muslims or by Muslims in China. So if we turn back to the mosques for just a moment, let's ask why it is that a minaret has become more Chinese when it is turned into a pagoda. The pagoda, as many people on this call will know, is generally attributed as a borrowing from Buddhist stupas, which of course came originally from India. But the pagoda is, and Buddhism also, are considered by the Chinese state to be essentially Chinese. So why is one borrowing Chinese and another borrowing not? Well, this is the magic of essentialism, where you freeze certain cultural traits from a certain period of time, project them backwards in time, project them forward in time. And so I think this is something we need to be very careful about. It leads to the idea that Islam is incompatible with some essential immutable Chinese culture. And it is ultimately the intellectual fuel for the Sinicization program. And it's something that I think is it's easy to do, it's easy to slip into. We're raised to think in essentialist ways. I don't think it's something to be ashamed of, but it does creep into our scholarship. And scholars in China are picking up on it, and it's giving support to them. Thank you.